The sun was still hiding behind the buildings when John woke up. The alarm had been ringing for 5 minutes, but he was already up, stretching his arms and making coffee. It was just another ordinary day in the life of a bus driver. Simple, yet full of small details that made all the difference. John was the kind of person you don't easily forget. Tall, with a smile that seemed permanently stuck on his face, and a calm way of speaking that could soothe even the most stressed-out passenger. He didn't have much, but whatever little he had, he shared without a second thought. And that's how it all began. That morning, the bus was packed as usual. People heading to work, students with headphones in, elderly passengers clutching grocery bags. John greeted everyone with a cheerful good morning that echoed through the aisle. Then, at one of the stops, she got on. Margaret. A gray-haired woman, dressed simply, but with eyes that seemed to carry a lifetime of stories. She tried to pay for her fare, but her card wouldn't work. "Sorry, ma'am," John said, looking at her with a warm smile. "Looks like the system is acting up today." Margaret rummaged through her bag, searching for some coins, but found nothing. "Oh, don't worry about it," John said, pulling out the money he had set aside for lunch. "I got this one for you." She looked at him, surprised. "You don't have to do that, young man." "Of course I don't have to," he replied, his smile growing even bigger. "But I want to." Margaret thanked him with a smile that seemed to brighten up the entire bus. And as she took her seat, she started chatting with John. She talked about the weather, the city, and how the little things in life can make all the difference. John listened, half focused on the road as he drove. "Do you have kids?" she suddenly asked. "I have a daughter," he replied proudly. "Emily. She wants to be a doctor. She's been studying like crazy for the entrance exams." Margaret smiled. "That's wonderful. The world needs more people like you and her." John didn't quite understand what she meant, but he thanked her anyway. When they reached her stop, Margaret stepped off with a wave and a "see you later" that sounded more like a "see you soon." The day went on as usual. John finished his shift, went home, and found Emily in the living room, surrounded by books and notebooks. "Hey, kiddo," he said, giving her a hug. "I'm practically turning into a studying machine, Dad," she replied, laughing. He smiled, but deep down, he knew money was tight. Medical school wasn't cheap, and he didn't want Emily to give up on her dream because of it. That's when the phone rang. John answered, having no idea that this call would change everything. On the other end of the line, a serious voice said, "Good evening, Mr. John. My name is Robert. I'm an attorney. I'm calling on behalf of Mrs. Margaret." John frowned. "Margaret? The lady from the bus?" "Exactly," Robert continued. "Margaret was a philanthropist. She spent her days testing people's kindness, and you were one of the few who passed her test." John was speechless. "Test? What do you mean?" "Margaret left a full scholarship for your daughter, Emily. Everything covered. Medical school, books, everything." Silence filled the room. John looked at Emily, who was watching him curiously, and felt tears welling up. I don't know what to say." "She also left a message for you," Robert said. "Margaret wanted you to know that kindness is never in vain, and that the world needs more people like you." John hung up the phone and looked at Emily, who was now standing, her eyes full of questions. "Dad, what is it?" He smiled, barely holding back his tears. "Emily, it looks like we just won the lottery." And at that moment, John realized that life has a funny way of surprising us. Sometimes, all we need is a little kindness. And maybe, just maybe, a bus full of stories to tell. John could barely sleep that night. The lawyer's call still echoed in his head, like a dream he was afraid to wake up from and realize wasn't real. He stared at the ceiling, wondering how a simple decision to pay for a bus fare could have such huge consequences. The next morning, Emily was glowing with excitement. "Dad, can you believe this? Medical school. Fully paid. It's like we just got a gift from heaven." John smiled, but deep down, he was still processing everything. "Yeah, kiddo. Looks like life decided to give us a little help." While Emily ran off to share the news with her friends, John got ready for another day of work. On the bus, he couldn't stop thinking about Margaret. Who was this woman? Why did she do this? And why had she chosen him? At the end of his shift, John received another call. It was Robert, the lawyer, setting up a meeting to go over the details of the scholarship. "Margaret left a few things for you," he said. "She wanted you to understand the impact of your actions on the world." John agreed to meet him the next day. When he arrived at the office, Robert greeted him with a firm handshake and a reserved smile. "Margaret was an incredible woman," he began. "She spent her life helping people, but always quietly. She believed that true kindness doesn't need a spotlight." John listened, fascinated, as Robert told stories about Margaret. How she had helped build schools, funded medical treatments, and even paid off entire families' debts. All without anyone ever knowing it was her. "And why did she choose me?" John finally asked. Robert smiled. "Margaret had a special way of seeing people. She believed that small gestures, like yours, reveal a person's true character. And she wanted to reward that." John felt a lump in his throat. "I just did what anyone would do." "Oh, John," Robert replied, his expression serious. "If that were true, the world would be a very different place." At the end of the meeting, Robert handed John an envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter from Margaret. "Dear John, if you're reading this, it means I've already passed on. But I want you to know that your kindness did not go unnoticed. The world needs more people like you. People who do good without expecting anything in return. I hope this scholarship helps your daughter achieve her dreams. And who knows, maybe it will inspire her to do the same for others. With gratitude, Margaret." John carefully folded the letter and placed it in his pocket. He felt a weight in his chest, but also a deep sense of peace. Margaret wasn't just a philanthropist, she was a teacher, offering lessons far beyond money. On his way home, John stopped at a park. He sat on a bench and watched people passing by. Children playing, couples walking, elderly folks chatting. He realized that each one of them had a story. And maybe, like Margaret, he could be part of theirs in some way. When he got home, Emily was in the kitchen, baking a cake. "Dad, I had an idea," she said with a mischievous grin. "How about we throw a party to celebrate? Invite the neighbors, friends, everyone." John chuckled. "I think that's a great idea. But, Emily, remember, this isn't just about us, okay? It's about what we can do for others too." She looked at him, thoughtful. "Like what you did for Margaret?" "Exactly," he replied. "She showed me that even the smallest things can make a difference." That night, as he helped Emily decorate the house for the party, John felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just about the scholarship. It was about understanding that life is made of choices. And sometimes, the best choice is simply to be kind. The party was a success. John and Emily's house was filled with laughter, music, and the delicious smell of freshly baked cake. Neighbors, friends, and even some of John's regular bus passengers showed up to celebrate the news of the scholarship. As Emily cut the cake, John looked around, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, but that day, everything felt right. Then one of the guests, an older man named Carlos, raised his glass and said, "A toast to John, the man who proved that kindness still exists." Everyone cheered, and John turned red. "Ah, guys, I didn't do anything special," he said, modestly. But Carlos insisted. "No, John, you did more than that. You showed everyone here that a simple gesture can change lives. And that's rare these days." John smiled, but deep down, those words struck a chord. He started thinking about Margaret, the letter she had left him, and everything she stood for. The next day, John decided to do something different. He took a portion of the money he usually saved for lunch and stopped by a bakery near the bus stop. There, he bought sandwiches and juice, carefully packed them, and took them to work. During his shift, he offered the snacks to passengers who looked tired or hungry. A young student, who always boarded the bus with sleepy eyes, thanked him with a big smile. "You saved my life today, John. I didn't have any money for breakfast." An elderly woman carrying heavy grocery bags nearly cried when he handed her a juice. "God bless you, sir. You don't know how much this helps." John didn't do it for recognition. He did it because it felt right. And somehow, those small gestures made him feel more connected to the people around him. At the end of the day, he received a message from Emily. "Dad, have you seen what's going around on social media?" John, who was never much into technology, was confused. "No, sweetheart. What happened?" "Someone posted about you. About the snacks you're giving out on the bus. The post is going viral." John opened his phone and saw it. There were pictures of him handing out the snacks, with a caption that read, "Meet John, the bus driver who's spreading kindness wherever he goes. How about we follow his example?" He was surprised. "I was just trying to do what Margaret would have done," he thought. But the impact was bigger than he expected. In the following days, passengers started bringing donations for him to distribute. One brought blankets, another brought bottles of water, and even a local teacher organized a food drive. John found himself at the center of a kindness movement he never even knew existed. And as he drove his bus, he realized this was just the beginning. At the end of the chapter, John sat on his couch, holding Margaret's letter in his hands. He reread her words, especially the part that said, "The world needs more people like you." And for the first time, he truly understood what that meant. It wasn't about being perfect or doing grand things. It was about being present, about doing good whenever possible, and about believing that every small act could create a ripple of change. He looked at Emily, who was studying at the dining table, and smiled. "Sweetheart, we never really know the impact our actions can have. But one thing is certain, kindness always comes back. And when it does, it brings more than we ever imagined." Emily looked at him, her eyes shining. "Dad, you're turning into a philosopher, huh?" John laughed. "No, kiddo. I'm just learning how to live." And in that moment, he knew Margaret had been right all along. Kindness is never wasted. It echoes, it spreads, and suddenly, the world becomes just a little bit better.